Sitting across from the estate attorney, I watched my mother and cousin smile triumphantly as the final will was read aloud. My parents had officially left everything, the family home, the investments, and their life savings, to my entitled cousin, Chad, leaving me with absolute zero. What they forgot in their rush to favor him, however, was that for the past 5 years, I was the one secretly keeping their entire financial world afloat through my personal accounts. I didn't yell, slam doors, or cause a scene. I simply stood up, thanked the lawyer, and quietly pulled out my phone in the hallway. Within 10 minutes, I canceled every automatic mortgage transfer, utility payment, and credit allowance I had set up for them. Exactly 1 month later, my mother sent a desperate text reading, "The mortgage is past due, and Chad's card declined." I smiled, typed 3 words, and changed everything forever. My name is Hannah. I'm 27 years old, work as a financial analyst, and if there's one thing 5 years in corporate finance taught me, it's how to stay completely stone-faced when reading a total disaster of a balance sheet. That skill was the only thing keeping my composure intact as I sat in a mahogany-paneled conference room on the 4th floor of a downtown law firm. The air in the room was heavy, smelling faintly of old paper and cheap coffee. Across the polished oak table sat my mother, Evelyn, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, pretending to be overwhelmed by grief. Next to her was my cousin, Chad, 28 years old, wearing an ill-fitting designer suit and leaning back in his leather chair with the smug grin of a man who believed the world owed him everything. My father had passed away 2 months prior, and today was the official reading of his restructured estate plan. I had taken the afternoon off work, expecting a straightforward proceeding. I didn't want a fortune. I just expected fairness. Mr. Vance, the family estate attorney, adjusted his half-moon spectacles, cleared his throat, and began reading the final codicil of the document. The language was cold, precise, and unambiguous. Every major asset, the 4-bedroom suburban family home, the investment portfolios, the liquid savings, and even my father's classic vintage car, was designated to go entirely and exclusively to Chad. I sat there, watching the ink on the parchment, waiting to hear my name. It never came. When Mr. Vance reached the final clause, he paused, looking over his glasses at me with a faint flicker of sympathy before reading the last sentence. "To my daughter, Hannah, I leave my deepest gratitude for her independence, requiring no further provisions from this estate." Translation: absolute zero. Chad didn't even try to hide his triumph. He let out a soft, arrogant laugh and nudged my mother. Evelyn offered him a warm, fond smile, resting her hand on his forearm as if he were the grieving son who had carried the family through its darkest hours. Neither of them looked at me. They sat there reveling in their victory, completely oblivious to the fact that their shiny new inheritance was a complete illusion. To understand how we ended up in that lawyer's office, you have to understand the absurd hierarchy of my family. For as long as I can remember, my cousin Chad was treated like royalty. His father, my mother's brother, had walked out when Chad was young, so my parents made it their life's mission to overcompensate. Every minor achievement of his was met with grand celebrations, while my straight-A report cards and corporate promotions were met with a casual shrug. Chad was charming, manipulative, and chronically unemployed, living off the delusion that he was an entrepreneur destined for greatness. When my father's health began failing 5 years ago, my parents hit financial rock bottom. Medical bills piled up, property taxes went unpaid, and they were on the brink of losing the family home to foreclosure. They were too proud to ask for help, so I stepped in quietly. I was 22, working 80-hour weeks at an investment firm and earning a very comfortable salary. Rather than humiliating my parents by handing them cash, I handled everything behind the scenes. I set up automated monthly transfers from my private account to cover their $2,800 mortgage. I put my personal credit card on file for their utilities, paid off their back taxes, and set up a secondary checking account that deposited a weekly $500 allowance so they could buy groceries and maintain their dignity. Over 5 years, I funneled over $200,000 of my own hard-earned money into keeping them afloat. I never asked for repayment. I did it because they were my parents, and I loved them. Chad, of course, had no idea. He saw my parents living comfortably in a pristine home and assumed they were sitting on a secret gold mine. He spent those 5 years whispering in my mother's ear, driving her to appointments, and convincing her that he was the dutiful son she never had, all while quietly nudging her to change the estate plan to exclude me. As we walked out of the law firm into the bright afternoon sun, Chad adjusted his coat and looked down at me with a smirk. "Don't take it personally, Hannah," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Some people are just born to lead, and others are born to manage. Mom, and I will be sure to invite you over for Thanksgiving, if you behave." My mother smiled, patting Chad's arm proudly. Neither of them realized that the house they just inherited, the accounts they planned to drain, and the lifestyle they took for granted were supported by a structure that belonged entirely to me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, yell, or give them the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I simply nodded, wished them both a pleasant afternoon, and walked down to my car parked in the underground garage. I sat in the driver's seat, resting my hands on the steering wheel, and took a deep, steadying breath. The initial sting of betrayal quickly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. If they wanted me to be the independent daughter who needed nothing from the family, I was more than happy to play the part. But independence works both ways. I pulled out my laptop, connected to my phone's mobile hotspot, and logged into my online banking portals. My fingers flew across the keyboard with methodical precision. First, I accessed the recurring automated clearinghouse transfers. With 3 quick clicks, I canceled the $2,800 monthly mortgage payment scheduled to pull from my checking account in 4 days. Next, I logged into my utility accounts. I removed my personal credit card from the primary file for the suburban house's electricity, gas, high-speed internet, and water bills, turning off autopay entirely. Then, I pulled up the secondary checking account, the one I had created specifically to fund my mother's $500 weekly allowance and cover her day-to-day spending. I transferred the remaining $4,200 balance back into my high-yield savings account and officially closed the secondary line. Finally, I opened my corporate credit card dashboard. Chad had been carrying a supplementary card under my main account for emergencies, a card he routinely abused for expensive dinners and designer clothes, assuming my father was reimbursing me. I revoked his user authorization instantly and flagged the physical card as lost, rendering it useless plastic. Within 10 minutes, every single financial tether connecting my hard-earned income to my mother and cousin was completely severed. I hadn't stolen a dime, nor had I broken a single law. I had simply stopped donating my life's work to people who viewed me as nothing more than an unpaid servant. I closed my laptop, placed it in my briefcase, and put my phone on Do Not Disturb for all unapproved contacts. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the afternoon traffic, ready to watch their house of cards tumble down. For 30 days, my life was blissfully quiet. I focused on my career, took a weekend trip to the coast, and enjoyed the peace that comes with finally dropping an unappreciated burden. But back at the family estate, the clock was ticking down on an invisible fuse. Chad and my mother had spent the month celebrating their brand new wealth, completely oblivious to reality. Chad had taken a group of his friends out to celebrate, boasting about his newly inherited estate and throwing his weight around like a self-made millionaire. The collapse happened on a Tuesday. First, the $2,800 mortgage payment failed to process. The bank sent an automated alert to my mother's email, which she promptly ignored, assuming it was a system glitch. 3 days later, Chad was at a high-end steakhouse with his friends, attempting to flex his financial standing by picking up a $1,200 dinner tab. He handed the waiter his supplementary card with a confident flourish. A minute later, the waiter returned, handing it back with a cold, professional smile. "Declined, sir." Red-faced and humiliated, Chad was forced to scrape together cash from his friends to avoid washing dishes. By the end of the week, the real panic set in. The secondary checking account ran out of funds, meaning my mother's automatic grocery orders were canceled. The electric company issued a final disconnection notice, and a formal letter arrived from the mortgage lender warning that the property was officially entering default due to non-payment. My mother tried to call her bank to fix the glitch, only to be informed that the account funding the mortgage and utilities for the past 5 years didn't belong to the estate at all. It was a private account held exclusively under my name, and all transfers had been revoked a month ago. At 6:15 p.m., as I was sipping tea on my balcony, my phone buzzed on the table. My mother had bypassed the main call line and sent a text straight through. "Hannah, there's been a terrible mistake. The mortgage is past due, the power is about to be shut off, and Chad's card was completely declined at dinner. You need to fix this system error immediately." I looked at the message, feeling no anger, no regret, and no urge to save them. I tapped the screen, typed 3 simple words, and hit send. Not my problem. 10 minutes after I sent that text, my phone blew up with furious calls from both my mother and Chad. I declined every single one. Less than an hour later, the loud, desperate pounding began at my front door. I opened it to find my mother looking utterly disheveled and Chad standing behind her, his face dark with fury. "Are you out of your mind, Hannah?" my mother yelled, barging into my living room without an invitation. "The bank says the mortgage hasn't been paid. They're threatening to put the house into default. You need to transfer the money back into the account right now." "Why would I do that?" I asked, leaning against my kitchen counter with my arms crossed, perfectly composed. "Chad inherited the house, the savings, and the estate. It's his property now. Maintaining it is his responsibility. We don't have the money." Chad snapped, stepping forward, his voice cracking with panicked anger. "The estate bank account only has $800 in it. Where is the rest of the money? Where are the funds Dad left for the house?" I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a thick folder of printed bank statements from the last 5 years, and tossed it onto the coffee table. "There was no secret fortune, Chad," I said, my voice ice cold. "Dad's business failed 6 years ago. The house was months away from being foreclosed on when I was 22. Every single mortgage payment, every utility bill, every property tax installment, and even Mom's weekly spending money came directly out of my personal salary from my job." Chad froze, his mouth opening slightly as he stared at the mountain of bank statements detailing hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing directly from my private account. My mother's face went completely pale as the horrifying reality dawned on her. "You thought you were inheriting a gold mine," I continued, looking Chad straight in the eyes. "You spent 5 years kissing up to Mom, convincing her to write me out of the will, assuming you were going to live like a king. But all you actually inherited is a house with a massive mortgage, thousands in past due property taxes, and monthly bills you can't afford. You didn't inherit a fortune, Chad. You inherited liabilities." "You can't just stop paying," my mother cried, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "This is your family's home." "It was my family's home," I corrected her gently, "until you gave it to the cousin who never contributed a dime and told me I was so independent I needed nothing from you. You got exactly what you asked for." The weeks that followed were an absolute financial disaster for my mother and Chad, and for the first time in my life, I watched the drama unfold entirely as an outsider. Without my monthly salary quietly pouring into their accounts, their grand inheritance completely unraveled. Chad quickly realized that owning a 4-bedroom house isn't free. Within 20 days, the electric company shut off the power, leaving them sitting in a cold, dark home. The mortgage lender officially served a notice of default, demanding full payment of the overdue balance plus steep penalty fees, or the property would face immediate foreclosure on the courthouse steps. Panicked, Chad attempted to put the house on the market for a quick sale, hoping to cash out before the bank seized it. But when the title company ran a routine search, they discovered thousands of dollars in unpaid local property taxes and secondary liens that I had stopped settling. Any potential profit from selling the house was instantly swallowed up by back taxes, legal fees, and bank penalties. The stress turned the golden child and his biggest fan against each other. Chad, furious that he had been handed a financial anchor instead of a cash cow, began screaming at my mother, accusing her of ruining his life and lying about the family wealth. My mother, heartbroken and humiliated, realized that the nephew she had idolized for decades only cared about her as long as she was funding his lifestyle. Within 2 months, Chad packed his bags, moved out of the darkening house, and left my mother to deal with the debt collectors alone. Meanwhile, I took zero chances with my own financial future. I met with my personal attorney to ensure my name was completely untangled from any secondary accounts, co-signed agreements, or potential liabilities tied to my mother's property. My lawyer confirmed that because every transfer I made over the past 5 years came from my private funds with no legally binding contract requiring me to continue, I was entirely protected. Standing on solid financial ground, I watched from afar as their house of cards finally touched the ground. They had spent years building a fantasy on my silent sacrifice, and now that the foundation was gone, they had no choice but to face the reality of their own making. 6 months after the final reading of the will, the dust had completely settled. The family home was sold through a forced short sale to satisfy the back taxes and mortgage default. Chad was forced to move into a tiny, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town and take an entry-level sales job, his very first real taste of actual work. My mother ended up moving into a modest studio apartment, living strictly off her small monthly Social Security check. She tried reaching out to me a few times through tearful voicemails, but I kept my boundaries firm. I didn't hold on to anger, nor did I seek revenge. I simply recognized that maintaining a relationship with someone who treated me as an utility rather than a daughter was toxic to my well-being. The experience changed me in ways I never anticipated. For years, I had been trapped in a cycle of people-pleasing, believing that if I worked hard enough and sacrificed enough, my family would finally love and respect me equally. Losing everything on paper made me realize that I had already built everything that truly mattered on my own. My career was thriving, my finances were completely secure, and my peace of mind was entirely restored. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for yourself is to stop fighting for a seat at a table where you were never truly valued. When you stop funding other people's entitlement, you quickly find out who actually cares about you for who you are, rather than what you can do for them. Today, as I sit in my own sunny apartment enjoying a quiet weekend, I look back on that afternoon at the lawyer's office not with bitterness, but with genuine gratitude. They thought they were leaving me with nothing, but in reality, they handed me my freedom. I walked into that room as an underappreciated safety net, and I walked out as a woman who finally knew her own worth.